In this clip, we are going to drill down on offensive fire combat. Offensive fire occurs during hasty attack and assault operations. In this example, the 39th Guards Motor Rifle Division is executing its activation cycle, and the 117th Guards Motor Rifle Regiment is executing its planned hasty attack operation against the West German units in the town of Renningen. The regiment has moved into its attack positions, and the NATO player has conducted his defensive fire. It is now the offensive fire call step of the operation. The Warsaw Pact player consults his fire support chart, finds a section for Warsaw Pact offensive fire support, and determines that during a friendly hasty attack he can make a fire call with one headquarters that has a subordinate unit participating in the attack to act as an observer, and that he is limited to calling a single friendly artillery unit. In this case, the Warsaw Pact player chooses to use his forward headquarters to make a fire call to his DAG to support this combat, with either of the attacking units able to act as the observer. Next, he totals the fire strengths of each of his individual units. This unit here has a fire strength of 4. This unit here has a fire strength of 12 for a total of 16. The DAG adds another 18. So the grand total is 34, which becomes 17 after the standard division by 2. The Warsaw Pact player consults the CRT and rolls a 7 for a +1 hit modifier, so the fire inflicts a total of 18 hits. As a special rule, when a player receives enemy offensive fire, he can elect to retreat. If he chooses to retreat, he can absorb a number of hits equal to the adjusted defense strength of the strongest unit in the hex. However, this is also the unit that must absorb any remaining hits first. If more than one unit has the same highest adjusted defense strength, the owning player can decide which unit will cover the retreat and absorb hits first. After a player absorbs hits by electing to retreat, he must absorb any remaining hits by step loss. During the ensuing retreat step of the operation, all defending units in the objective hex must retreat 1 hex according to the priorities outlined in the retreat priorities chart. Alternatively, the defending player can elect to absorb all hits by step losses and hold the hex. Let's examine both possibilities in the case of this hasty attack operation. The Warsaw Pact player has inflicted 18 hits. The NATO player must decide how he wishes to absorb them. First, the NATO player determines that his tank unit has an adjusted defense strength of 6 +1 for the cover that it is in, for a total of 7, and that his infantry unit has an adjusted defense strength of 3 +4 for the town it occupies, or 7, so both units are equally strong. If the NATO player elects to retreat, this election will absorb a number of hits equal to the adjusted defense strength of the strongest unit in the hex, which in any case is 7. The total of 18 hits inflicted, less the 7 for electing to retreat, will leave 11 hits to be absorbed by step loss. Losing 1 step will absorb another 7 hits, leaving 4 hits that can be ignored as insufficient to claim another step. So, electing to retreat means the NATO player would lose only a single step, but it would also mean that he would be forced out of the town and into a clear terrain hex. If he fails to win the initiative next turn, he risks losing the whole force to an enemy fire strike and a follow-up attack. On the other hand, if the NATO player does not elect to retreat and holds the hex instead, he would have to lose 2 steps, absorbing 14 hits, allowing him to ignore those remaining 4 hits. In the event the NATO player does elect to retreat and declares that his infantry unit will serve as the covering force, he must then lose 1 step, which must come from the covering force or his infantry. Accordingly, he eliminates this unit And then during the ensuing retreat step, he looks at the retreat priorities chart and determines that he could retreat into either this hex or this hex. He chooses to retreat into this hex here in order to be able to hold his line. On the topic of retreat, let's take a brief look at the retreat priorities chart itself. The first 8 lines of this chart indicate conditions where a unit cannot retreat, meaning that if this is the only choice that it has, it must stand and die. The next 6 lines at the bottom look at the retreat priorities that a player needs to attempt to avoid, but is still allowed to actually retreat into. So his first priority is not to retreat into a hex that is adjacent to an enemy unit that is just fired. His second priority is not to retreat adjacent to any other enemy unit. His third priority is not to retreat into a minefield, etc., etc. So a player is required to retreat into a hex that avoids all of the higher priorities that can be avoided. But he is still allowed to retreat into a hex that meets any of these conditions here. Now, having cleared the hex, in the ensuing advance step, the Warsaw Pact player can advance his units into the objective hex. This advance puts them adjacent to the retreated units, which engages them and therefore forces them to flip to their use side. This means that they will be unable to perform any operation for the remainder of the turn. This ends the Warsaw Pact player's hasty attack operation for the 117th Guards. It is important to note, in looking at how hits are absorbed, that in all fire combats, that is to say, all offensive fire, defensive fire, infiltration fire, and retreat fire combats, it is always the strongest unit in the target hex, the unit with the highest adjusted defense strength, that absorbs hits first. No hits can be applied to a weaker unit, even if that number of hits would be sufficient to claim steps from that weaker unit, until after the strongest unit has been eliminated. In this sense, stronger units always cover for weaker units during fire combat. This approach contrasts with strikes. In a strike, it is always the weakest unit that absorbs hits first, and no hits can be applied to a stronger unit until all weaker units have been eliminated. This principle is one of the critical principles for absorbing hits in this game. And that concludes this clip.